about the object. Any given object that's made by an artist is and declared art by whoever made it as whatever artist made it, I think it's safe to say is kind of dependent upon an audience to see it. That is kind of part of the definition of what it is. So to say that social practice is distinctive because it engages other people, actually, it doesn't really make it that different than any other art in the world, because all of it, even if it is a minimalist object that is meant to function, meant to achieve a state of radical independence, it still is dependent upon somebody else seeing it. It's like that koan or whatever, you can't, if you're not seeing it, what does it matter? So a characteristic of social practice, yes, of course, is that it involves other people and it engages other people in ways that step outside of what's normal or conventional in a traditional art viewing context, like a gallery or a museum. Those are characteristics. I guess you could also say that another characteristic is that in the course of that engagement, special skills are not required, that there's a privilege of shared collective activity over expertise. So, back in the 80s, I guess it was, when Rikrit, or maybe 90s, when Rikrit Tirvanesia began serving Thai food, actually it was the 80s, everybody knows how to eat, so he's creating this environment of making, the creative act of making, and then the receipt of that is eating the food, and the practice is the structure, the environment created by this artist who, set the whole thing up. This is not really a definition. This is a series of characteristics, I guess, that probably are on many of the other lists you've received from people. But I guess I'll start with that for now.
Okay, thank you. Could you give me an example?
It's hard to pick just one, and the many that I can think of offhand are really quite different, and are also a bit chameleon-like, some more than others, because some of them masquerade as institutional programming, others masquerade as sculpture. So let's take, for example, the sculpture. Luis G. Hernandez, I just showed an object that he made that was generated by a desire to, a hospitable desire to provide water, drinking water, in a context where there wasn't any readily available. So the artist had been going back and forth between LA and Mexicali, kind of maintaining strong personal and professional relationships in both places, and as he continues to do. And when he first began doing this a number of years ago, he was involved with an alternative space in Mexicali that didn't have any drinking water. There was no drinking fountain, there wasn't a store nearby for it, it was just hard to get a drink of water if you were thirsty. So he concocted an object comprised of various kind of found objects gathered from a nearby flea market. And so he got a table, a fairly rickety looking table, and set upon it a 5-gallon jug of water, and rigged a pump up into that 5-gallon jug, and the pump led to a little drinking fountain that he'd found, a little, like you depress the button and a little spout, water comes out of a little spout. So he had this little makeshift, very, this assembled object that was a drinking fountain. And he filled it up with water. He actually, because he would commuting from LA to Mexicali, he always brought water with him. And so he assembled this object and got one of his 5-gallon jugs of water that he'd brought with him, water that had come from LA, set it up and provided a sculpture that was a fountain, which of course has its wonderful Duchampian references right there, but became a very functional object and a piece of artwork. And it was beautiful. You know, he presented it at this Mexicali gallery, and it was in this exhibition, and it was lovely. And then he had an opportunity to present it again here in LA, and did everything the same way, except that he filled the 5-gallon container with water from Mexico rather than with water from LA. So for visitors to the gallery in Mexicali, he could barely keep the container filled. You know, it always had to be replenished. Every time he came down, he had to bring more water. But here in LA, where it was presented, no one would drink from it. So a hospitable gesture became perceived of as one that presented a threat, maybe, certainly not hospitable, or a kind of twisted hospitality, or a ambivalent hospitality, perhaps. So there is something about social practice in that. There is a kind of implication, I think. There is an invitation to engage on a very basic level. There are choices to be made. This little intact, discrete object falls outside of what we think of social practice, of course, because well, for one thing, it lacks the quality that you characterized, which I think is not inaccurate, about collectively produced. There's a quality of collective production, but at the same time, to kind of fulfill the piece, there is certainly a moral choice that's very much a part of the piece. It's almost like you could list it in the materials. So that's one example. And then another example that looks very different would be, perhaps you could say, the Big City Forum project that we do. Now, Leonardo Bravo, who is an artist who conceived of and has developed that project, has never used the term social practice to characterize what he's doing with regard to Big City Forum. He may even disagree with me on that characterization, and I'm not even necessarily saying that I would call it that, but it is something that looks like that as well. An artist initiating a non-studio based project that I don't know, builds engagement and in fact relies on engagement for it to exist. So those are two examples. You know, there are many more, and there are many that are probably more obvious looking in terms of what seems to be emerging. For example, we did a fruit jam with fallen fruit at Pasadena Earth and Arts Day last year, and the year prior to that, we did a melon making concert thing with Machine when they did the same thing at LACMA with you. So, you know, we've done, I think, a broad range of things that we can do because artists have been ingratiating themselves with institutions in ways that allow for this, I don't know, broadened idea of what we can do. So I would say some of the biggest challenges have been finding ways of conveying the substance of this kind of work to potential supporters who are incredulous or confused by it. There's obvious challenges in terms of production, which there are with anything that you do. I mean, you can be shipping an object from someplace and have it get damaged in transport, and that can be a challenge, you know, as we're dealing with right now on a whole other matter. So, yeah, there's obvious, you know, oh, we don't have enough tables, or we didn't get enough melons, or, you know, we need more melon, whatever it is. Those things are obvious, but I think in terms of a kind of systemic, genuine investigation of work that's falling under this umbrella title, the challenge, and to sound like a fundraiser, the opportunity is in trying to tell a persuasive story, or at least an inviting story for getting support for it. I think how I see it evolving, and how it maybe even in a sense at risk of evolving is with, I think institutions are generally getting more kind of on board with finding those systemic ways of supporting non-object oriented investigations through the institution. I think at best this kind of work can start to influence what goes on in education departments, and as we've seen so brilliantly with Mocha and Andre Stang's work there. But I think in many ways, certainly in direct application here at Armory, where we have such a robust studio-based art program, what can that actually mean if you want to deal with contemporary practice that doesn't necessarily remain in a studio? What do you do if you're a program like ours? And here, these questions, we're scratching the surface with those.